All right. Thank you. Okay. Got the technology beaten into submission. Good evening and welcome to St. George Orthodox Christian Church in Spring Valley, Illinois. It is Wednesday, January 29th, 2025, and this is the last in our four-part series on ancient Christianity in the British Isles. And you may notice that I've changed the title for this session. It used to say 1066 and all that. I changed it to The Vikings, the Normans, and Henry VIII, oh my. It's partly because we didn't get as far last week as I hoped we would when I planned the sessions last fall. Mostly because I realized that after the 8th century, which is kind of where we left off last week, Christianity had some pretty steep ups and downs, and that continued right up to the present. So that seemed appropriate. But anyway, hang on, we'll see how things go. First, last commercial for Orthodox Tours, the company that takes us, Ruth and me, on these pilgrimages to ancient Christian countries, pilgrimages that generate these kinds of talks, owned and operated by Father Ilya Gotlinsky, who's an OCA priest in Pennsylvania, and he's an expert in Christian history. And one of his great talents is finding experts all over the world to take us on these tours. So at the bottom of the slide are places he's planning to go this year. We have our sights set on the Baltics and Poland, and maybe we'll be talking about them sometime in the future. Anyway, if you're interested, Google orthodoxtours.com, or you can talk with us after the session. So on to this week. We always start with prayer, but this week I thought I'd do something a little different. After that session on St. Bede last week, I had a question, Mike, among others, raised it, about what language the English and the Irish used in worship. And the answer is basically Latin. That's what St. Patrick spoke. That was the official language in the Roman Catholic Church in all countries, actually right up until the middle of the last century, Vatican II. But both the English and the Irish, particularly the English, also used the vernacular, that is the common language, in writing and in prayer. And in particular, there was a lot of translating into Anglo-Saxon, or as it's commonly called today, Old English. You may remember that Bede himself, on his deathbed, finished his translation of the Gospel of St. John into Old English. So I thought we might just do the opening prayer tonight, making it the Lord's Prayer in Old English. When Alfred the Great prayed the Lord's Prayer, like if he were about to eat or something like that, this is about what it mostly sounded like. Let us pray to the Lord. Fader ura, thu theert on heavenum, si thin nama Jeholgod, to becometh in riche, je worth thin willa an eordan swaswa on heavenum. Erne je die wamliken halaf, sulas os to die, and forgivas ura giltus, swaswa we forgiveth urum giltendum. En ne je laad thu os on kostninge, ac alus us of uvilla soth liche. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. And I don't know how to say that in Old English. I will not take the time right now to explain the words or the letters. If you want to dig into it more, we can talk after the session. But just to explain, there are several letters there we don't use anymore. That's partly why it looks strange. But take my word for it, this is the language that developed into what we speak today. I mean, the biggest thing that changed it was the Norman conquest, when a lot of French words came in. But I will mention one Anglo-Saxon word that was used by Christians back then and it's still used today. It's not in the Lord's Prayer, it's the word gospel. It started out as the Anglo-Saxon word godspell, which means good news. God with a long O gives us the word good today, and spell means news or speaking. The word was coined, it was invented by Bible translators, and it's a direct translation of the Greek word evangelion, which means the same thing, good news. The ev or u is good, and the angelion is news or message. The angeli, the angels, are so called because they're messengers. So when you use the word gospel, in a sense, you're speaking Old English. All right, so to resume our history, I thought I'd first recap the last 3 weeks, what that professor from the University of Nottingham called the waves of Christianity that make British Christian history unique as far as I know. And most of these waves we've seen in the past 3 weeks. First, the first Christians appearing in Britain during the Roman Empire occupation, and especially when Rome became Christian. Then as Rome started to decline, just as Rome started to decline, St. Patrick Christianized Ireland, which returned the favor a little while later by sending missionaries back to Britain and, in fact, all over Europe, as you saw. And then right at the end of the 6th century, Rome herself returned to northern England thanks to St. Gregory. Southern England, what did I say? Northern England, southern England, yeah, southern England, thanks to St. Gregory. And then the Synod of Whitby settled that the churches in Britain would follow Roman practices and governance. They were already all using Latin. They would follow everything do everything the way Rome did it, which takes us up to where we left off last week. So this week, we'll see what happened when the Vikings started raiding. And in spite of that, England became a united country and a unified church. And then like I was saying at the beginning, then the Normans invaded in 1066. But the church kept plugging until 1536, when Henry VIII massively changed the Christian church in England and Ireland and a whole lot else. And we won't spend much time on that because I'd like to leave some time at the end tonight to look at today, what we experienced on our visits, and a few really neat things that are happening with the Orthodox Church in the British Isles. So if you remember last week, I said the 7th and 8th centuries were a sort of golden age for Christianity in Britain. And I also said the golden ages often end badly. Well, the end of the 8th century, that's the end of the 700s, there was a new set of invaders coming to England and Ireland. There had always been waves of invaders, and this was another group, Scandinavian pagans, who are usually called Vikings. But that word just means that they raided, kind of like Scoti just meant pirates originally. And actually, the Scandinavians didn't always raid. They were terrific seafarers, and they started visiting more civilized places. They would often visit for trade. They would often settle. They'd start farming. But if a bunch of Vikings landed someplace and found a lot of wealth and not much defense, they would raid. And one type of place that quickly became their favorite was monasteries. Now, they raided monasteries for the same reason that the bank robber Willie Sutton was supposed to have said he robbed banks. That's where the money was. Monasteries always had gold and silver chalices and things. They had a lot of land. They had a lot of grain and cattle. And monks weren't really very good at fighting back. Glendalough in Ireland may have been the first to be attacked sometime between 775 and 790. Glendalough was burned down at least 9 times over the next 100 years before the monks finally gave up and left. They attacked Lindisfarne in England, remember that from last week, starting in 793, and then again at least 4 more times, carrying off sacred items every time, as you see in this illustration. And the monks finally abandoned the Holy Island in 875. In fact, Vikings raided most of the places that we visited the last 3 weeks. Iona, Inishmurray, Bangor Abbey, Hohnford, Clonmacnoise, Monkwearmouth, Jarrow, so on and so on and so on. This stone is in the Lindisfarne Museum. It's called the Viking Raider Judgment Day stone, and it was made sometime between 800 and 825 during the early years of the raids. There's 7 male figures on that. 6 of them are carrying axes or swords. Presumably they're Vikings. Now, one interpretation of this stone is that it's a reminder that Christ sits in judgment of sins. But it also hints that people were seeing raiders like this as a sign that maybe the end times were coming. I mean, remember, it was getting on toward the year 1000, and some people thought the millennium, that would be when Christ returned. People have always thought that in times of disaster. Remember, Christ told us it's not for us to know the times which the Father has set. So even if Vikings show up tomorrow, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the second coming. Now, the Vikings had their biggest impact at first in Ireland, maybe because it had better monasteries to loot, I don't know. Although I should make it clear that the title on this map, Viking Raids, is a little misleading because, again, they didn't just raid, they also traded and they settled. The red dots on this map, both the black dots are mostly monasteries they did raid, but the red dots represent permanent settlements which grew into the first real cities in Irish history. Ireland, as you recall, was little towns, little enclaves, very small kingdoms. Really, the first real cities started with the Vikings, starting with Dublin, which of course became Dublin. And Vikings also founded Limerick, Cork, Wexford, Waterford, and so on. But it was only a matter of time before they also started attacking England. And over time, they occupied major sections of England. Increasingly, they were battling the local kings. So the local kings had been working to try to combine the smaller kingdoms into a real country. And fighting the Vikings didn't make that any easier. One of those local kings who fought the Vikings was Edmund, King of East Anglia, who was killed in battle in 869. He was only 28, but he'd been king for 13 years, and he'd been brought up Christian, and he had allied himself with King Alfred of Wessex. Remember, Wessex means West Saxons, just like Essex means East Saxon, and so on. So it was the southwestern kingdom on the other side of southern England, but Edmund had allied with him. Edmund was captured in battle after his army was defeated, and the pagan Vikings ordered him to renounce his faith and share power with them. He refused, so they tied him to a tree and shot him to death with arrows, kind of like Saint Sebastian in the 3rd century. They then decapitated his body as a further desecration. But the head was found, it was thrown out into the wild, but it was found with the help of a wolf. A wolf barked, hick, 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 which in Latin means here, here, here. And Edmund's followers came to see what the wolf was barking about, and there was his head, and they retrieved his head. And according to the legend, when they brought his head back and replaced it on its body, it miraculously reattached itself. Edmund did not come back to life, but at least his head was in the right place. Now, because he had died for the faith as a Christian fighting pagans, he was very soon venerated as a saint. And when England became a unified country under Alfred a few years later, Edmund was recognized as the first patron saint of England. This is at least 200 years before St. George got on the English radar. So St. Edmund was originally the patron saint of England. He was buried at a place called Bury St. Edmunds. And I had always assumed, well, they called it that because that's where they buried St. Edmunds. That's not right. Bury was another version of the word burg, like in Pittsburgh. It meant city. So basically, Bury St. Edmunds is just the city of St. Edmund. It's about 80 miles northeast of London today, in still what's still informally called Essex. There was a very large abbey and monastery that grew up around the place of Edmund's burial. And the shrine in the crypt below the abbey, where his body was buried, became a hugely popular pilgrimage site. This inset picture at the bottom shows King Henry VI kneeling at the shrine, and he was visiting in 1433. So you can see the veneration of St. Edmund continued a very long time. Now, Bury St. Edmunds also became politically important and very wealthy, but we'll get back to that a little later. The abbey is long since gone, the abbey being the monastery, but there is still an impressive church at Bury St. Edmunds. And nearby, amid the surviving buildings, you see a bronze statue of Edmund with his friend the wolf over there, ready to tell people where his head is. Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of heads, makes a natural transition to another consequence of the Viking invasions, and you'll see the connection in a minute here. I mentioned earlier that Lindisfarne, which became that great center of monasticism and evangelism, they finally closed in 875 because they've been raided at least 5 times. One of the most important things at Lindisfarne was the body of St. Cuthbert. You recall from last week, he'd been venerated as a saint for a long time by now. His tomb had been opened a couple times, and it was always incorrupt, which is one of the signs that he was a saint. So the monks, as they were leaving Lindisfarne, decided to take his body with them. You can see the beginning of the journey in this mural painting. This is from the church at Chester-le Street, which we'll see in a little bit. And notice, you remember that from last week, seabirds, Cuthbert loved seabirds and helped them in various ways. The seabirds are thronging around, bidding Cuthbert farewell. Now, this was a start of a journey for Cuthbert's body. It lasted a couple of 100 years. He may be the best traveled posthumous saint in history. Now, along with Cuthbert, the monks took the relics of St. Aidan, if you recall, he founded Lindisfarne, and the head of King Oswald, who was now St. Oswald. This statue of him holding his head is in Durham Cathedral. We'll see that a little later on. Now, the monks initially tried to return Cuthbert to Ireland, but the waves pushed them back. God was telling him, Don't send him back to Ireland. Then the abbot had a vision in which St. Cuthbert told him to go to the Danes who had seized territory in the area. If you remember, I showed you the map a few slides ago of the areas that the Northmen had taken over. They should go there to ransom a noble slave who was destined to become king of Northumbria. So they went to the Danes, said, we understand you've got a slave who's supposed to be king. What do you want for him? They ransomed him, and the new king gave them land in a place called today Chester-le-Street, which I mentioned a couple of slides ago. It's a strange sounding name, but Chester is from the Latin word for a military camp, castra, and street indicates that it had been on a Roman road. So Chester-le-Street basically just means camp on the Roman road. At Chester-le-Street, the king built a beautiful church, which developed into a major cathedral. This is the interior of that church today. Of course, it's been added onto an altar, but there are undoubtedly some stones in there that go back to the original building. Here's a close-up of the altar. And if you look closely at the statue on the right, that's St. Cuthbert, and he's holding in his right hand St. Oswald's head. St. Cuthbert gets portrayed that way a lot. Cuthbert and Oswald remained at Chester-le-Street for about 110 years, and it again became a great site for pilgrimage and received enormous gifts from kings and commoners. But in 995, the Danes started getting restless again, and conflicts got more severe, so the monks moved the relics to Ripon, about 60 miles to the south. This is the front of Ripon Cathedral today. Every place St. Cuthbert went ended up with a big church. And there's the interior today, just to give you an idea what some of these churches look like inside. But this is probably what it looked like back then when it was first built. This is the crypt underneath the church, and it represents the original structure that was built in the 7th century before Cuthbert's body was moved there. Now, the monks didn't stay long at Ripon. Things cooled off with the Danes, and they were able to move back north. And they were trying to figure out where to go. A voice had told them to go to a place called Dunholm, which is Durham today. And they traveled on until the cart got stuck in the mud, and they couldn't get it out. And they asked the locals where they were, and the locals said, "You're at Dunholm." So the mud had stopped them where they were supposed to be. They built a temporary wooden shelter out of tree limbs, which is shown here. But pretty quickly, a stone church was built and then a cathedral, and that's where Cuthbert, along with St. Oswald's head, have been ever since. The body of St. Cuthbert, along with the head of St. Oswald, was laid to rest in what became Durham Cathedral. As in the past, when they moved him into the new tomb, they found his body still incorrupt, and it was not just incorrupt, it was supple. They could move the limbs as though he were just sleeping. This is a close-up of his coffin as it was reconstructed in the 1800s. You can see some of the rather nice iconography that was carved into the coffin when he was first buried. And there were several remarkable things that they found in the coffin with him. These possibly had been buried with him. They were possibly added some of the several times he'd been disinterred, including the time that he was disinterred when he was first made a saint. Now, one of these, of course, we saw last week, was his pectoral cross. This is reproduced here as a processional cross at Chester-le-Street, but the original was small enough to fit on his chest. There was another one, was a tiny pocket Gospel of John, written by one of the scribes trained at either Wearmouth or Jarrow beads monasteries late in the 7th century. This gospel may have been used by Cuthbert or may not have been, but even if it was placed in his tomb after he died, it's likely the oldest European book still in its original binding. Now, this is Durham Cathedral today. Again, it's a good deal larger than it was when Cuthbert was buried there, but it's been continually enlarged over the centuries. This is a sign of how highly venerated Cuthbert was and still is. He's venerated in a lot of different places, and this is one of the major cathedrals in Britain. Here's the interior. And I could show you a lot more pictures if we had time. It's gorgeous, and it seems to go on forever. Cuthbert's chapel is tucked away in another part of the building. This is Ruth, my wife, about to go in up these little stairs and into that smaller room. And that's his chapel. He rests under this slab. And on the far right, well, on the far right above him here, you can see that head, that statue of Oswald holding his head. And over here, that wall hanging, That wall hanging represent Oswald's final battle. I showed you that last week. On the slab, there's a single name in the Latin style, Cuthbertus. And if when you're standing looking at that, you bend your head straight up and look up at the ceiling, you see Christ sitting in glory, looking down over his servant, who had been buried in 5 different places, but has stayed in Durham since 1104, along with the head of another saint, Oswald. As shown, again, always shown this way, in this window from York Minster Cathedral. Now, given the huge importance of Cuthbert to the Christian church all over England, I thought it might be appropriate to repeat his tropar from last week. You may remember that chanting it then, I recall the little memorial service we held on Lindisfarne, his original burial place. This one represents his final resting place and his role in spreading the faith since, and it's in Byzantine tone 1. I'm sorry, tone 3. While still in thy youth thou didst lay aside all worldly care, and didst take up the sweet yoke of Christ, O godly-minded Cuthbert, and thou wast shown forth in truth to be nobly radiant in the grace of the Holy Spirit. Wherefore God established thee as a rule of faith and shepherd of his rational flock, O converser with angels and intercessor for men. Holy Cuthbert, pray for us. Well, we have spent a lot of time on St. Cuthbert, both last week and this week, but he's a saint of enormous importance in Christian British history, even if we're not all that familiar with him here. So with that, let's return in our history to the time when the translation of his relics started. Remember, it lasted a couple hundred years. So we're going back from there to the 9th century, the late 800s. The struggle against the Danes that had cost Edmund his life continued, was finally brought to a conclusion by one of the most remarkable men in English history, Alfred the Great. And I have to say, we did not run into him very much on this trip, but I can't leave him out. He started as King of Wessex, far southwestern England, but he was good at making alliances. If you recall, he was allied with Edmund. And in 878, not too long after Edmund was killed, after many years of struggle against the Danes, he scored a decisive victory, and he signed a lasting treaty. It required the Danish leaders to become Christian, which they did, and it established a territory called the Danelaw, which is shown on this map. That set the boundaries of where the Danes ruled. After that, Wessex was able to combine with neighboring Anglo-Saxon states, and that was the start of the country of England. Now, unlike a lot of kings, Alfred wasn't just good at leading battles. He was a sort of Renaissance man. He developed an infrastructure to make the country run better. He introduced coinage like this coin from the Museum of Lindisfarne. He encouraged literacy. Among other things, he encouraged translation of books into Anglo-Saxon, returning to the topic we talked about at the beginning. He may even have done some of this translation himself, but mainly he hired or gathered up a lot of translators. They published works of Latin philosophy. They wrote a history of the English called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is it and Bede's book are probably the two best sources of early English history. He was also a very pious Christian, and he produced an English translation of the 4 Gospels, which was used somewhat liturgically. His influence was responsible for the fact that the version of Anglo-Saxon spoken in Wessex became the standard language across England, because there were various dialects depending on where you were, but that one became prominent. So that version of the Lord's Prayer we saw at the beginning owes a lot to Alfred the Great. Now we're coming toward the end of the time when Christianity was becoming the dominant religion of the British Isles. So I'm going to jump quickly over a couple of centuries. England continued to consolidate after Alfred, so by the middle of the 11th century, it looked roughly like this. England and what's now Scotland were the major unified nations. Ireland was still a bunch of smaller kingdoms. And England had become very prominent among European countries, a leader in culture, a leader in a lot of ways. we tend to have a kind of feeling that England was sort of backward. In fact, it was way ahead of most of the countries on the continent. But then 1066 happened, and England was invaded again, this time by a peoples called the Norman French. Came from a place of France that's now called Normandy. The Norman French really weren't French. That was the language they spoke, but the word Norman really means Northman. These guys were Vikings again. They had taken over parts of France, just like the Danes had taken over parts of England. Their leader, William, asserted a claim to the crown of England. But the actual king of England was a man named Harold. He was a great, etc., grandson of Alfred the Great, and he disagreed with William's claim. But despite his best efforts, the Normans defeated the English at the famous Battle of Hastings. This scene is part of the Bayeux Tapestry. It shows Harold being hit in the eye with an arrow, which killed him. Right below the Latin explanation, Haroldus Rex interfectus est, that is, Harold the King gets killed. Harold's burial place is traditionally at Waltham Abbey, which is a bit north of London. It's a spot that's today marked by a simple stone, staying mostly in English this time, Harold, King of England, and then they had to throw in a little Latin, obit, 1066. Now there is also a little statue of him tucked in the niche on the right toward the top of this picture of the bell tower at Waltham. I don't think I even noticed that statue when I took this picture, because mostly what I was focusing on was all these different levels of stonework, which I'm sure represent different centuries of construction. This is the oldest and then the newest, and then the top stuff is pretty clearly much newer. In a way, that tower is symbolic of the aftermath of the Norman conquest, because it changed a lot of things in England. Mainly it had a huge impact on the language. But it was not a new wave of Christianity. Christianity kept on. The Normans were Christians under Rome, just like the English were Christians under Rome. The most obvious changes were architectural. Now, early Norman churches, of which this is an example, are not much bigger than the Saxon churches we saw last week, but they immediately look somewhat different. This is the Church of St. Michael and All the Angels at Copford Green. That's near Colchester, about 60 miles northeast of London. You may remember Colchester. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, the legendary birthplace of St. Helen and St. Constantine. It was also the original capital of Roman Britain. This church was built in about 1130, so about 60 years after the Norman conquest. You can see right away the pointed bell tower. You never would have seen that in a Saxon church. And as you go around to the west end of the church, you see buttresses, these pillars on the corners that look like stair steps as they go up. They're there to support the walls. And since those are outside supporting the walls can be thinner than in Saxon churches, which means the windows can get bigger, as this one is, because the walls were thinner and the buttresses were supporting, so they didn't have to worry too much about cutting such a big hole in the wall that the wall would fall down. Some of the arches at this time start to be pointed rather than rounded. You see the rounded arch over there, but the pointed arch here. That's also a Norman feature. It was probably brought back from the Middle East when the Crusaders saw pointed arches in Muslim buildings. So if those pointed arches there are original, and I'm not sure about that, they might have been put in later, but if they were original, they were an innovation. They were brand new, almost experimental at this point, because the first crusade had only been a few years before, and that would have been the first time the English would have been exposed to the pointed arch. Now, if you back up from that view, you also see a common thing in old churches. It wasn't built all at once. This side on the right here, which is where that entrance is that we saw first, is obviously extended some years after the church was first built. You see the buttress here. Without that extension, the profile of that church would have been similar to the Saxon churches that we've seen in our weeks before. So inside, you can see how that worked. This is the original nave, narrow, high, and notice all the arches are rounded. This wooden truss roof is a later replacement. Originally, the roof was a barrel vault like the stonework over the altar, which you can see a little bit of here. You can see how the roof was built up over the original arch. And these are nice icons of the Annunciation and the visit of the Magi. They're relatively recent, probably 19th century. They look a little Victorian, but they're still pretty. Then at some point, the church was extended to the right. So this you're now looking forward, but you're looking to the right of the old nave, forming an additional aisle, which is under that roof extension you saw earlier. And notice pointed arches on the new wall at the right, which is another indication that it's newer. But I'm going to stop to show you a piece of art that is the real jewel of Copford Green Church. Originally, when it was originally built in 1130 or so, the entire interior of this church was adorned with fresco icons, actually 34 of them, according to the records. Most of them have been lost through the years, sometimes just damaged, like moving the wall. More often, I would say having to do with what I might call iconoclasts. There were people starting in the 1500s that thought there was something wrong with sacred paintings. Many of them were destroyed. A lot of them were whitewashed over, and that happened in the Copford Church. But fortunately, this icon has survived, and it's in remarkably good shape for being almost 1,000 years old. It represents the raising of the daughter of Jairus, and I've never seen another icon on this subject just like it. Most icons of the raising of the child of Jairus show the moment when Jesus is taking the dead child's hand and saying Talitha cum, meaning child arise, bringing her back to life. But this one moves back in time a little bit. This shows a moment earlier than that. Jesus has just arrived at the house after the child has died. Now, the child is clearly dead. Her mother is standing there regarding her with grief. And Jairus, the father, is in the middle of the scene. He's basically blocking Jesus's way because he's assumed that we've gotten there too late and it's too late to do anything. But Jesus is looking past him. He's looking directly at the girl, knowing that he's about to bring her back from the dead. This portrays a moment of doubt, a moment when faith is needed the most. And I have to believe the iconographer was fully aware of that when he selected that moment to portray. Now, speaking of art, I'm going to pause for one more brief commercial. Almost all the churches we visited in England last year and Ireland the year before that are struggling financially. Attendance has dwindled. Sometimes they have only part-time clergy, and they always have a box or a credit card reader asking for donations like here. At the Copford Church several years ago, 2 members wrote and illustrated a story set in the churchyard at Copford. It's a story about neighborhood cats trying to catch a swarm of mice that have infested the church. The artist used actual tombstones in her drawings, actual tombstones that are hundreds of years old. She even drew actual neighborhood cats. And the resulting book, The Mice in the Churchyard, was published in 2013, and it's available on Amazon for about $20, including shipping from the UK. We bought a copy. It is a delightful book for children of any age. It's got great pictures. It's even got a surprise ending. So if you've got any kids that you'd like to give a book to and read a book to, grandchildren, children, godchildren, whatever, for a birthday or Christmas or whatever, and at the same time help a historic English church, go online and check this one out, The Mice in the Churchyard. Okay, end of that commercial. I said earlier the Norman Conquest didn't exactly produce a new wave of Christianity in England in the sense of converting pagans. The British Isles were Christians before 1066, they were Christian afterwards. But over time there were changes. One was in patron saints. Edmund was officially replaced by St. George in the early 15th century. This ancient icon of St. George is in a shrine at Walsingham in East Central England. The veneration of St. George, who started out in the Middle East, he was martyred in the Middle East. He'd been brought back from the Crusades, starting out with Richard the Lionhearted, who went over there, fought a lot of people, saw St. George, saw him as a warrior saint, and said, great, that's my personal saint. And the cult of St. George gradually grew. His red cross is visible today in the flag of the UK, the Union Jack. That's the cross of St. George. It's combined with the X cross of St. Patrick for Ireland and the white X cross of St. Andrew for Scotland. And I'll leave it to your imagination to put those 3 crosses together. You have the Union Jack. Now, other than the change in patron saints, again, the most noticeable changes were architectural. I mentioned the peaked arch. Among other things, it is structurally stronger than the old rounded arch, and it allows bigger and taller windows and doors. The earliest Norman buildings still used a rounded arch, but the peaked arch started to become dominant about 100 years after the conquest. And that combination of better arch design and buttresses for support, which you also see in this picture of Durham Cathedral, allowed the Normans to build higher and higher, and some of the cathedrals became really immense. And increasingly, the churches became, in effect, two-story, with another layer of windows above the main nave. The whole effect is that the stone walls almost disappear, and the church seems to be made out of light. Now, this is not Durham, this is York Minster. This is about 70 miles south of Durham. And I'm going to use York Minster as an example in the next couple minutes to show you the full flowering of Norman church building as we saw it on our trip. Now, part of the reason for picking on York Minster is, frankly, that York itself is just a fascinating town. Started out in 71 AD as a Roman city called Eboracum, and became capital of the northern province of Roman Britain, south of Hadrian's Wall. This map, which I found on the web, is Italian, so Murala de Adriano is Hadrian's Wall. To this day in York, there is a lot of Roman stonework still visible, including this Roman column, which is conveniently labeled Roman column, if you see that sign on it, and quite a few miles of the old walls that fortified the cities. This is where sentries would have walked on top of the wall, keeping watch. So Roman soldiers walked that 2,000 years ago. Passageways inside the old fortifications coming down from the walls. Roman soldiers would have gone down there at the end of their shift. And right in front of York Minster, this bronze statue of the Emperor Constantine that commemorates the fact that while he was born in Colchester, it was in York that he was proclaimed emperor in 306 after the death of his father. Now, York today is a thriving industrial city, but it is still dominated by the cathedral and its grounds, as shown at the top of this schematic. York Minster, in fact, is the largest Gothic church in Northern Europe. The cathedral itself was built in several stages over the centuries. This legend over here shows how the various layers were put on. And the layout of the church follows the cross shape, which is common in Gothic churches, which you may be able to see a little more clearly in this wooden model. It's not as pretty as that picture on the previous slide, but it's simpler. And this model also shows you how the external features line up with the floor plan. So in the foreground, of course, is the nave where the common worshipers stood, with bell towers on either corner. Then the transept, the cross-shaped area in the middle, which has another tower on top, the central tower. There are no bells in that one. Then past the transept is the choir. In this area starts to be only for clergy. And then the altar area at the east end. And if you get into the altar area, you see the most magnificent of a whole lot of magnificent windows in York Minster. This is the creation window. This is the largest expanse of medieval stained glass in Britain. It dates from the early 15th century. The top part represents God and heaven. Then there are 3 rows of Old Testament scenes, including the creation itself. Then the middle section depicts the apocalypse, and the bottom section is full of historical figures. And I know you can't make out the details here, but our daughter Ellie did manage to get a close-up of the Old Testament scenes, which include the creation of Adam, and then the eating of the forbidden fruit and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Now, you were having trouble seeing these pictures in the previous slide. There are 3 or 4 stories above the floor, so even when you're standing in York Minster Cathedral, without a telescopic lens, I don't know whether anybody could see them even back then, but only the clergy could get there anyway, and presumably they knew what they were. The other end of the church, about a block to the west, is a window that worshipers could see, again, assuming they had really good eyes. It's also called the Heart of Yorkshire window, because if you look at this stone tracery at the top, there's the outline of a heart. Here's a close-up, again, taken by our daughter. The bottom 3 tiers are various figures, which I'm assuming are saints, bishops, maybe some kings. I haven't found a source that explains all that detail. This window dates to the 13th century, so it was about 100 or 200 years before the creation window. Now, one other detail of medieval churches is carved faces and heads. You may remember seeing some of these on the door of Clonfert Abbey, where St. Brendan is buried. Well, they're all over the Norman period English churches too. Some of them, like I'm assuming these, portray kings or queens or bishops, but many of the English faces get very fanciful. This is the knocker on the main door of Durham Cathedral. I'm not sure whether the fringes around the face are intended to be vegetation or rays of the sun, but either way, this is kind of a disturbing thing to confront when you come to the door of a church. It may have been intended to repel evil, I'm not sure. But who knows what the purpose was of this face. This is on a ledge some feet off the ground at one of the churches we visited. It's common to call these kinds of things gargoyles. Technically, they're called grotesques, which they certainly are. Now, Norman churches featured a special type of grotesque called today green men. This one's in a roof boss connection where the rafters came together at the church of Croyland Abbey. These are faces wrapped in foliage that often goes in and out of their mouths like this. It was once thought these were original pagan images, but modern research has determined they didn't do this in pagan times. These simply started to be placed in Norman churches and remained for a few hundred years until they fell out of fashion. They may represent the dangers of temptation and how evil can lurk around the edges of our lives, although not all of them look all that evil. This one from York Minster actually looks pretty pleasant, but they're just there, and there are hundreds of them. We could spend a whole presentation just looking at green men. Whatever they mean, these grotesques are part of the Norman architectural tradition. Now, in the evening of the day that we spent at York, we'd spent a lot of time around the York Minster Cathedral, and we walked around the Minster to an area where they are working on a renovation project on part of the cathedral that's deteriorated. They're always fixing up these churches. You may remember the scaffolding at Canterbury a couple of weeks ago. There was new stonework that was being prepared for installation. This is new stonework that had just been carved. Now, most of those pieces were just pillars and moldings like those, but there were also several brand new grotesques that had been carved. This was just carved sometime in the last year or so, waiting to be put somewhere in York Minster. This one with the frog coming out of its mouth was a fairly typical example. I can only hope it was intended for a spot in the Minster high enough so people wouldn't be able to see it very clearly. Now, two topics I should touch on very quickly in the history of England and Ireland. They're both political, but they're inseparable from religion. And one is the conflict between England and Ireland. That started in around the end of the 12th century with a man named Richard de Clare. He was the second Earl of Pembroke. He's also known as Strongbow. This is his, and I see Tom nodding and pointing. This guy is not, interestingly enough, this is his tomb in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. More accurately, this is probably his cenotaph because his remains are probably not there anymore. Why exactly it's in Dublin and in a place of honor, considering that he's the one that invaded Ireland, I'm not sure, but he is there. He was instrumental when the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland took place in around 1170. Now, like William the Conqueror, he claimed to have some kind of legal right to the land he occupied, but whatever right he may or may not have had, that invasion started more than 800 years of English rule over an increasing amount of Ireland. Now, just like every other invader before, the English apparently liked the fact that Ireland is fertile and its wonderful climate and its chance to get really rich if you steal the land from the people that had it before. By 1450, Ireland had been carved up roughly like this. This area called the Pale, which included Dublin, was outright held by the British Crown, and it was surrounded by various degrees of hostility. That's where the phrase "beyond the pale" comes. You didn't go beyond the pale if you were British, because it was also surrounded by thorny hedges and a 10-foot ditch to keep the barbarous Irish out. Violence, including rebellion and mass slaughter of the rebels who rebelled, flourished starting under Queen Elizabeth, and by 1603, when James I took over the throne of England after Elizabeth died, Ireland was being ruled from London. Within 100 years, Scotland and England combined into Great Britain. They continued to rule Ireland. In 1801, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was created. Things got steadily worse for the Irish during most of that process. The 19th century saw the population of Ireland drop from about 8 million in 1841 to about 4 million 80 years later. At least 1 million died in the Great Famine that started in the 1840s, which the British did not do a whole lot to help out with. And maybe 1 million more emigrated during that time for the same reason. And emigration continued at a rate of 200 to 250,000 people per year till the end of the century. And 200 to 250,000 people a year, when you only start with 8 million, there aren't a lot left. From the 1870s to the 1920s, various levels of violence raged between the Irish and the English, till finally, in 1922, the English government accepted the creation of the Irish Free State. Eventually, that became the Irish Republic, although in the process, London carved out Northern Ireland, which is still part of the United Kingdom, and you can see that here. Not going to get into that very much. It's a long, long story. If you are interested in seeing an excellent depiction of the end of that process, the process that led up to 1922 and what happened afterwards, strongly recommend that you read a movie called Michael Collins, which was also recommended to us by our guide, Mike Burniston in Ireland. Shows a much younger Liam Neeson starring as Michael Collins, who was one of the central figures in finally pushing the British to grant relative independence to Ireland, and what happened to him before, during, and after. Now, things are relatively peaceful today, thank God, but in Northern Ireland, you still see signs of 800 to 900 years of conflict. For instance, this barrier which runs down the middle of Belfast, separating the Catholic from the Protestant neighborhoods, or this sign on a building in the middle of Belfast protesting the alleged actions of Sinn Féin, which was one of the historical political entities consisting of Roman Catholics resisting the Protestant government. Again, it's politics, but it's also religion. Now, on our way through Derry in Northern Ireland, we saw the Peace Bridge. Derry, which is called by the English Londonderry, but it was never called Londonderry by the Irish. The Peace Bridge is a bike and pedestrian bridge. It was built in 2011, and it crosses the river. The river separates the traditional Catholic neighborhoods from the traditional Protestant neighborhoods. The bridge is interesting. It sets out from different points on opposite banks. They're points that don't line up. They're not across from each other, but the two branches curve together to symbolize unity. And this looked great. We drove past it and said, oh, this is very promising. We got to our hotel that night, looked at the news, and pretty much at the moment we were driving through, a group of local youths who were presumably Catholics were attacking a group of police who were presumably Protestant, and they put several officers in the hospital. Nobody died, but it was bloody. So there's still a way to go to heal the old wounds. The other historical topic relating to religion in the British Isles may partly explain this sectarian conflict, and namely it was the creation of the Anglican Church, which came to be a major opponent of the Roman Catholic Church. And for this, we can just simply blame Henry VIII. He took control of the English Church away from the Pope in 1534. Now, the common explanation for that is that the Pope wouldn't let him divorce and remarry. It's actually not going to be his first divorce and first remarriage, but that may have been one of the points that kicked him over into controlling the church. But another explanation is that big monasteries and churches by this time had accumulated so much power and wealth that Henry saw them as a political threat, not to mention horning in on his tax collection. And Bury St. Edmunds, I told you we'd come back to Bury St. Edmunds. Bury St. Edmunds was a great example. This is what the church grew to look like. By one estimate, at its height, Bury St. Edmunds owned all of West Suffolk, and it charged tariffs and taxes on just about everything that happened in the area. I read somewhere that they even charged tax for horse manure that had been dropped on the street. I don't quite know how that worked, but they were immensely rich, and they had the power to set their own laws without respect to the king's government. The abbey had acquired so much wealth over the years, it had its own fortifications and a massive gate, which you can see here. The grounds were very extensive, a huge complex of buildings. The abbot of Bury St. Edmunds was enormously powerful, as shown by the size of his house, which is not there anymore. This is a historical sketch. He sat on the House of Lords. He controlled the town and most of the country around. He had the status of a bishop, even though he was technically just a monk, and he reported directly to the Pope. So in effect, Bury St. Edmunds was like the Vatican. It was a state within a state. It was a sign of the power of Bury St. Edmunds that it was the place where in 1204 the nobles met to challenge King John with what became the Magna Carta some while after that. This is an early statement, I'm sorry, 1214, not 1204. This was the year before the Magna Carta was signed, which was an early statement of the limits on the king's power. But they picked Bury St. Edmunds to have their meeting. To this very day, the king, the city, and the county have their own coat of arms. It memorializes the Magna Carta. The Latin here reads Sacrarium Regis Canabula Legis, which means the shrine of the king, that is Edmund, the cradle of the law, that is Magna Carta. Notice, by the way, at the top there's a wolf, and that's St. Edmund's head, if you recall that detail from the story of his martyrdom, the wolf guarding his head. The grounds of the abbey included an enormous garden, which today is the second oldest botanical garden in all of Europe. And Bury St. Edmunds was not the only powerful monastery. All the big monasteries, this is Hexham Abbey in Northumberland, they all had huge incomes that the king couldn't touch. So by 1536, about 2 years after he took over the English church, Henry had enough. He dissolved all the monasteries in England. It's called the dissolution of the monasteries. He expelled all the monks, appropriated all the lands. It left just a few clerics at each church to take care of divine services. And across England, this was a huge blow to the English church, but also to the people, because the English church and the monasteries, as rich as they were and as self-serving as that sounds, represented a sort of social safety net. That's where people went for alms, where people went for medical care and so on, and all of a sudden that was destroyed. Bury St. Edmunds was pretty much torn down, except for the church building itself. The stone from the buildings was sold to construct other buildings. It's a huge blow to the church. It's also true that the churchmen, like the abbot of Bury St. Edmunds, had gotten pretty far away from the ideal of selfless service that's supposed to be the essence of Christianity, not to mention monastic asceticism. This wasn't very monastic, and it wasn't very ascetic. So there may be a lesson for us there in not trying to enrich the church too much. We're getting close to the end of our time together. We pretty well covered the amount of British history that has to do with the development of Christian church. British history went on a long time after this, all kinds of kings and so on, whose names I've never kept straight. But I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes or so looking at our general impressions of England and Ireland, and then specifically the surprising way the Orthodox faith is establishing itself in both countries. Now, I've made no secret of my partiality to Ireland, both because of my personal family background and because we found it such a unique blend of natural beauty, deep spirituality, and just general friendliness. And as a writer, I'm also proud that there are probably more great Irish writers than in any other country in proportion to its size. And the Irish are very proud of that too. This is the Liffey River that runs through the heart of Dublin. There's about a dozen bridges. It's not a very long river. 3 of those bridges are named for authors. This most modern one, this most recent one, is named after Samuel Beckett, the 20th century theater of the absurd playwright. There's 2 more bridges. One of them is named after the radical playwright Sean O'Casey, and another one after the great novelist James Joyce. And others are named after other significant people like Daniel O'Connell, who led the fight for Irish independence in the first half of the 19th century. Generally, my memories of Ireland are open spaces. Everything was green, mountains in the distance. The land actually seemed to stretch into the distance a lot more than in England, even though England is 2 or 3 times the size of Ireland. Now, I don't know about that, but we spent a wonderful afternoon with okay, I'm sorry, I think I just skipped a slide here, but in any case, coming from the wide open spaces to an Irish pub. The Irish pub claims, I had a slide here showing this, but apparently it disappeared. This is a pub called the Brazen Head, which claims to be the oldest pub in Ireland, claims to have been founded in 1198. I don't know about that, clearly not in that particular building, but we spent a wonderful afternoon with some of the best Irish music imaginable. And as you can see, it was an amazingly intimate setting. That's Ruth sitting basically right next to the flute player, who was also the fiddle player. So I'm going to give you a quick sampling of the music that we sat for 3 or 4 hours listening to. The two people dancing here, this was the only time they danced. The rest of the afternoon, they were part of the instrumental group. This lady in white played the Irish drum, and the guy in yellow sang and played the spoons. That was how we spent our Sunday afternoon that day. The Sunday morning was also special in another day, and I'll get to that. Overall, in Ireland, while things were certainly close together in the little towns, I never got the feeling of being cramped. In England, everything feels just much closer together, and I don't mean this as a criticism. The land, you know, their land area may be 2.5 times that of Ireland, but their population is 12 times that of Ireland. So the population density is like 5 times greater. And there are many pleasant places in Ireland. We were privileged to stay in one of them after the tour. We stayed for about 4 days with friends that we've toured with before. They live in Cuxton, which is a small village east of London near the sea. And it was lovely, but it also demonstrated how things have crowded together over the centuries. You can see how tightly grouped those houses are. Even the walking paths, such as the one this picture was taken from, are often public rights of way across people's property. And that's just the way it is. There have been cities in England at least 1,000 years longer than there have been in Ireland, and things have just gotten built up. You can even see that on the open roads. You know, in Ireland, we saw a lot of open space, and there are certainly parts of Great Britain like that, particularly toward the north. But most of the roads we drove looked like this. Those sides of the road, right up to the edge, are hemmed in with either hedges or what's called coppices. Those are groves of trees whose growth was managed over hundreds of years, providing barriers, but also allowing harvesting of wood in useful sizes and forms over time. And they still line the roads for as long as you can see. Now, we had a great time in Ireland. We had a great time in England. They're both welcoming places with wonderful history. They're just different. Even though they're only separated by, at most, 100 miles of water. In many places, it's a lot less than that. One thing they have in common is growing numbers of Orthodox churches and worshipers. Even though the native churches of England and Ireland have been estranged from Orthodoxy for 1,000 years, Orthodoxy is coming back. This is the best estimate I can put together from various sources of the Orthodox presence in the British Isles today. And I won't swear by the numbers. For instance, comparing the number of churches to the number of reported Orthodox, either there's something wrong with those numbers or there are a lot of Orthodox who don't have a church to go to, which is quite possible. Same thing in Ireland. The last census showed 100,000 people who said that they reported that they were Orthodox. Well, they couldn't all fit into 25 churches on a Sunday morning. So a lot of them do not have a church. But overall, there is no question Orthodoxy is growing. For instance, in Ireland, There were no Orthodox churches at all before 1969. England goes back farther than that. The oldest Orthodox presence is probably Russian. Priests traveled with Russian diplomats after Peter the Great opened up to the West in the 17th and 18th century. The Greeks have been there a long time, too. And our own Antiochian church has a presence in both countries. You remember our visit a couple of sessions ago to that chapel of St. Helen in Colchester, which was an Antiochian chapel. And I said they'd outgrown the little church they had been leasing. This is the full-size church they were about to move into in September. I hope they have completed the move now. It's just a few blocks away. There probably hasn't been a lot of immigration from Arab countries recently. That historically was where Orthodox believers came from into England and Ireland, just as it was here. But I'm guessing that this growth has to be largely converts. And that was definitely the impression we had our first Sunday in Ireland 2 years ago. Remember, I mentioned the afternoon was the Brazen Head. The morning was special too. Well, the morning we were in church. We were at St. Peter and Paul Russian Orthodox Church in Dublin. Now, the service was mostly in Slavonic, and most of the worshipers seemed to be Slavic, but there was a fair smattering of non-Slavic young people who must have been Irish converts, like these folks at the back of the communion line here. The Russian Metropolia has a bit more than a dozen churches around Ireland and Northern Ireland. This one's probably the biggest. This is the outside of the church I just showed you the inside of. They have leased or bought an old Church of Ireland church, and they've completely transformed it inside into a fully Orthodox temple. They've taken out all the pews. They've built an iconostasis, which I showed in an earlier session. It was the one with the icons of the Irish saints across the top. And at the bottom, a mix of Irish and more traditional saints below. It is obviously a thriving church. There must have been 200 or 300 people in the liturgy when we were there on that Sunday morning. And it was incredibly welcoming and friendly, and of course, beautiful music, as there always is in a Russian church. In England, we saw more signs of orthodoxy than in Ireland. For instance, a surprising number of Anglican churches had authentic Orthodox icons in them, such as these. This is the Rochester Cathedral, but those are clearly Orthodox icons. And I could show you a lot of other examples if we had time. But we also saw clear signs of real Orthodox churches multiplying. I just showed you the growing Antiochian church in Colchester. Well, our first Sunday in London, we attended the services at the center of the Antiochian mission to Great Britain, which of course is named after our patron saint, St. George. At this moment, they're celebrating in an Anglican chapel, which is small but quite beautiful. And we enjoyed a liturgy in a mixture of Arabic and English. Again, a lot of the worshipers were immigrants, but there was also a lot of English used. Several were clearly Brits looking for the traditional church. Now, many, if not most, of the Orthodox communities in Britain use former Anglican buildings. This is a unique example. It's in Brookwood Cemetery near London, which is the largest cemetery in the UK, just incidentally. This church was built in 1909 when the arts and crafts style was in vogue, and that's that temple at the steeple there is arts and crafts style. It was taken over in 1982 by a brotherhood of monks that's headed by a bishop in Athens. It was established to venerate the relics of St. Edward the Martyr, not to be confused with St. Edmund, the former patron saint, though they were nearly contemporaries, since Edward was murdered for the faith in 978, and not to be confused with St. Edward the Confessor, who was later than this. St. Edward's relics had been lost during the dissolution of the monasteries, but they were rediscovered in the 1930s, and they are here for veneration. It's a lovely little church with a number of beautiful icons, which I don't have time to show you all of. I will just show you one very nice one of my wife's patron saint, St. Ruth, which was on one of the walls. We have to move on for a quick look at another Anglican church that's used by one of the smaller Orthodox groups in Britain, the Bulgarian Church. This is where we worship with our friends in Cuxton. Our friends are not Bulgarian, they're actually Ukrainian, but Bulgarian Church serves Slavic immigrants and a few native English as well. But perhaps the most remarkable Orthodox place we visited in Britain is in Essex. It's a place called Tolleshunt's Knights. I have not yet researched what Tolleshunt means, but Tolleshunt Knights, Knights. It's the monastery of St. John the Baptist, and it was founded by a remarkable saint, St. Sophrony the Athonite. He was originally Russian, and he's best known for his biography of another Athonite saint, St. Silouan the Athonite. He was also Russian. He was of peasant stock. He went to Mount Athos at age 26 in 1892 and lived there the rest of his life. He died in 1938. Silouan was almost illiterate, but he was known for great wisdom and for frequent visions of Christ. He was canonized in 1987, and after St. Sophrony went to Athos in 1926, Silouan became Sophrony's principal spiritual guide and teacher. And after he died, Sophrony compiled all his memories of Silouan, together with lessons he taught orally, but also lessons that he had scribbled down, mostly in pencil on scraps of paper. And he published an extensive book in the early 1950s. Initially, it was in Russian, but an English translation was published in 1991. It's about that thick, and if you're interested in a lot of interesting spiritual commentary, I can recommend it's called Saint Silouan. Sophrony, in turn, died at age 96 in 1993 and was canonized in 2019. His tomb is beneath the monastery in Essex, where we are shown there venerating him. I wish we had more time to show you around this monastery, but here's a quick tour. Now, before he had become a monk, St. Sophrony had been a professional artist. And when he dedicated himself to the church in 1924, he started out as an iconographer. So when he came to Essex in 1958, having spent many years in Mount Athos, he then spent many years building the buildings and in iconography, and the results are amazing. We particularly enjoyed this Noah's Ark on the side of one of the monks' residence buildings. But the dining hall is also covered with icons of saints. Most of these, I'm sure, were done by St. Sophrony. And there are several chapels. The monastery is a double monastery, both men and women monastics, which was similar to some we've seen before in this series, the monastery that St. Bridget sent up, the one at Whitby Abbey in the 7th century. I don't know how many monastics it houses at the moment, but it's clearly growing, as witnessed the new church that was under construction when we witnessed it when we visited there last fall, obviously to accommodate more and more worshipers. I had a question from somebody who attended a couple of weeks ago. Are there still monastics in Britain? Well, the answer is yes. The damage Henry VIII did in the 16th century when he dissolved the monasteries, and the damage that's been done in the centuries that have followed by worldliness and materialism, that damage can't last forever, and this is one proof that God does prevail over time. And I will end with this quote from St. Sophrony, who's shown here. This quote seems particularly appropriate to the history of England and Ireland, but also to our world in general today. Quote, "The wisdom of this world cannot save the world. The parliaments, the governments, the complex organizations of the most advanced contemporary states are powerless. Humanity suffers without limit. The only solution is to find within us the wisdom and the resolve not to live according to the ideas of the world, but to follow Christ." Amen. And that is the end of our time together tonight, and this is the end of the 4-part series. I hope you've enjoyed the presentations and have not only learned, but also been at least a little bit inspired. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah.
Is there any questions anybody wants to get into the recording? I'll be glad to entertain them. Otherwise, I will shut down the recording. That went a bit longer than an hour. It went an hour and 10 minutes.
You mentioned how the iconography was whitewashed. Don't know if you heard, but in some ways,